The Roundtable rolling. A great pleasure to welcome all of you in this afternoon for what I know is going to be an absolutely great event. It is a major public program event as part of our series this term. It's obviously masked entirely in the form of a fantastic family reunion of work in a remarkable diploma unit that's taken place over the last near 2 decades here at the school. I think all of the equipment is hooked up. The lights dimmed briefly in Bloomsbury as things were turned on a couple of hours ago, so I think we're ready to go. Rubens and Julian will be keeping the technology running all afternoon. Amongst the hundreds, if not thousands, of films that I'm sure Diploma 3 students watched, debated, and discussed over the last couple of decades, there's a film that's a favorite of mine called The Conversation, starring a young Gene Hackman, filmed by a younger Francis Ford Coppola, and famously edited by Walter Murch, maybe the 20th century's great film editor, which records the obsession and paranoia of our recording, filming, and documenting of the modern world. And it's a story of a man who gradually tries to reveal the truth of the world and discovers, in fact, that however much we record the world, what we create is another kind of reality and not a picture-perfect demonstration of the truth as we already know it. It's one of many, many films that this unit looked at over the years, I'm sure, to create a culture that's simply unparalleled in any architecture school anywhere in the world, I would argue, from the early 1990s forward, that tries to embed, let's say, the 20th century's dominant technology, that of the lens, much more than any particular kind of camera, into considerations of space, architecture, and our experience of those kind of things in the modern world. We're here today, of course, to celebrate a remarkable unit meeting, the unit meeting of all unit meetings in a school that reinvented the term about 40 years ago in the early 1970s, when the idea was resurrected of an architectural pedagogy and learning built around a year-long educational project that would grow from within the work of the students within the unit. Over 17 years, the work of Diploma Unit 3 interrogated not just architecture and what developed into one of its great obsessions, the topic of film and the filmic description of space. They interrogated as well the very idea, I think, of what a diploma unit would be in a school like this, to remarkable effect and success. Today's afternoon coincides with the publication of a beautiful document of a very small slice of the hundreds and thousands of conversations and projects and diagrams and drawings that emerged out of that. Julian, Löffler, and Rubens, Azevedo over the last year have worked very hard with many people in this room to gather together projects, documents, stories, anecdotes that tell the story of that great project within the unit. They'll be talking a little bit about that more as part of this roundtable discussion. As I say in a very brief introduction at the beginning of this, I think one of the great lessons of the work to a school like this, of course, is the way in which the unit itself both evolved and was allowed to evolve in terms of its own interests and obsessions. When I came back in the mid-1990s to the AA after having been away for a decade, I was simply stunned to find the work being done the way it was. It was very different from the world I knew that Pascal was driving in the mid-1980s here. And one of the first things he said to me, and I think it's a remarkable thing, is that he's the one that learned from the work of his students about where his ideas and ambitions should be going. And that's really what I think is being documented in this beautiful small book, which we'll be launching at the end of the afternoon's conversation. A final point for those of you that don't know it is that it's the second volume of a little series that we secretly and stealthily launched in 2005, Pascal's fantastic Manifesto for Cinematic Architecture, which I hope all of you have read as a preface to today's discussion and the work that's being talked about here. If all the recording devices work the way they're supposed to, what we'll also be doing is capturing content, ideas, and discussion, which will form what's always the interesting part of any trilogy, the final volume in this particular series. So welcome everybody as a part of that and enjoy a fantastic units discussion. Thank you everybody for coming in.
So this is working. Hello and welcome everybody. Brett said already a lot of things that I was going to say. I'm just going to add a few words about the book. the book is several things at once, which is the usual thing or was the usual thing in Diploma Unit 3. There are two journeys in there. One journey is in time through 17 years of Pascal teaching at the AA, and the other journey is through space, and it is through a series of cities and sites that were the subject of research and confrontation for the unit over those 17 years. Starting with historically loaded sites like Vienna and Paris, then moving on to a phase of very heavily charged sites, post-war Sarajevo, Hiroshima in this phase. And then in the final years, there was a phase of, we call them Mediterranean paradises, places where there were no problems to be solved. So the task for the student was, in a way, to create the problem. Yeah, I mean, this is almost all I want to say about the book. This table here is, in a way, the same thing as the book, but also very different, because when the book is a finished piece, and black and square as well, this white round table is, in a way, the open version of it, and it contains, or it seats 11 different positions, which are more or less contradictive, possibly, which we will find out now, and which we hope is, so the book we hope is also not a documentation of the past, but also a starting point for the unpredictable conversation that we will all witness now. Now I'm going to pass over to Ingerid, who is going to moderate the conversation. Sorry, before that, shouldn't have forgotten, before that Pascal is going to say a few words as well. Just a moment. Sorry.
He forgot that. Doesn't matter. No, I just would like to thank Brett, the school, and the students, especially the students over the years who have contributed so much and put their energy in suffering with the unit. And I want to like to thank the participants in the round table today, and also Tom and Pamela at the print studio, and of course Rubens, Julian, and Stefan Dösinger. I just would like to tell a short story for those people who haven't heard anything about the former DIP3 and cinematic architecture. Some time ago, about over 100 years, oh no, yeah, about over 100 years, young Albert Einstein were standing on a bridge and looking down on the rails and trucks. And when he looked down, the rails were parallel. And then he looked to the horizon, but the rails did meet. And what he did was he went down from the bridge and went along the rails, but they never met. And he went on and on, and it got dark, and he couldn't see anymore. But in the horizon, effectively, they still did meet. So why do I tell the story? because it involves fundamental things. When I was a kid, I did the same, not knowing that Albert Einstein did it before. And his thing did lead to the relativity theory, finally. And my thing did lead to the cinematic architecture. Why? Because you have a situation when you look down off the bridge, which is a kind of static situation, and then it needs time or process to walk along the rails to find out the continuing condition. And this is different, of course, from what you see in perspective. And also, when you walk on and the light goes back, you can't see anything anymore. So there's some elements of cinematic architecture in. It's a static situation, it's a time or process, and it's the light, and that's the base of that. The whole thing is also packed, of course, in a narrative. Okay, I hope that makes everything more unclear than it already was.
Okay, can everybody hear? Are these things working? Do we have to speak very, very close? Okay. My name is Ingerid Helsing Almaas. I taught with Pascal many years ago, and I am a moderator for today's conversation around this kind of strange kind of poker table. So I'm the house and kind of croupier of the conversation. So. And I'll try to keep some kind of thread going. So if everybody during the course of the conversation, please place your bets and your bids with me. And only speak out of turn if you are in the grips of some uncontrollable passion. I thought we would start by an initial round where you can all identify yourselves and give the audience an idea of what you are bringing to the table. And I will start with myself, perhaps. As I said, my name is Ingerid Helsing Almaas. I studied with Pascal in my diploma year and went on to teach with him for 4 years before I left for Oslo in 1999, where I'm currently the editor of the Norwegian Review of Architecture.
My name is Martino Stierli. I'm an art historian from Switzerland. I'm involved in a research project on iconic criticism at the University of Basel. I teach at ETH Zurich and at the University of Zurich, art and architectural history. And to be quite honest, I think I am the real outsider on this table, so I feel a bit strange to be the first one to raise my voice here. The first time I heard about this unit that we're going to talk about today was about 3 weeks ago, when I was more or less, I guess by coincidence, invited to take part of this roundtable, and I'm kind of looking forward to playing a bit maybe the devil's advocate as the outside observer of what has been going on here.
My name is Eyal Weizman. I joined Diploma Unit 3 in 96, 97. I feel I've been in it since. Since graduating, I was involved in several things. I was teaching in Vienna, in Haifa, and most recently at Goldsmiths, where I'm the director of the Center for Research Architecture there. It's a PhD and MA program. And I write most recently on the intersection of violence, human rights, and architecture.
Hello, I'm Peter Carl. I think I'm here because I used to be an examiner and always admired the films. So I was the soft touch when it came to being RIBA. I taught at Cambridge for 30 years. I'm now running the new PhD program at LMU.
I am Jean Attali. I'm a philosopher, but having been involved with architectural realm for years, and especially interested in the relationship between the world of images and cinema and the philosophical or theoretical discourse. I'm currently teaching at l'École nationale supérieure d'architecture de Paris-Malaquais. The school is located on the School of Fine Arts, l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris.
I'm always tempted to say that I don't know who I am, but it doesn't matter. I'm Ron Kenley. I'm also teaching in Paris at another school of architecture than Jean, but that doesn't stop us working together. I have never been a student of the Diploma Unit 3, but I think I have been a friend and companion of Pascal for many years, and I'm very proud to have been part of one of the first workshops abroad of the Diploma Unit 3 in a project that we shared with Pascal from its foundation, which was Unité d'habitation Briey-en-Forêt since 1989, a place where a number of experiments were possible. And over the last, 5, 6, 7 years, a number of prominent members of Diploma Unit 3 and therefore of cinematic architecture have worked with us in Paris for 1 week a year with Pascal and some of the teachers. And I guess I'm here because I was looking for the genealogy of cinematic architecture, and I tried to write something at the end of the book.
I'm Brian Hatton. I've been teaching at the AA for a long time. I'm a small-time art historian, petty art critic, petty architecture critic sometimes, a long-time, somewhat bemused admirer of Diploma 3, and visitor to many crits, and the observer of many short films. And yeah, I think that's enough.
I'm Keiichi Ogata. I was in Dip 3 from 1994 to 1996, when it was my toughest time in my life, and but that pushed me to create a project called Hiroshima Through Light, which is based on the idea of memory, time, journey, and cities.
I'm Carlos Villanueva Brandt. I teach here at the AA. I think I'm a sort of professional witness here. I've seen the whole process grow. I've known Pascal for many years. I've taught for 25. I think he might have taught for 24 in all, and saw the birth of the project and very interested in especially what it's done and the support of the unit.
My name is Stephen Ware. I'm a former Dip 3 student. I got my diploma the same year as Keiichi. I now practice full-time in Paris. We do mostly commercial and hospital work. So it's a long way away from the theoretical world of Dip 3. Just to pick up on your point about feeling like the outsider, I remember that at the time when I did my diploma, I was the only person in the unit who didn't have a computer, so that made me feel extremely handicapped. But being an outsider is also partly what the essence of being in Dip 3 is about. It's about constantly getting into this contradictory position with respect to what we're being asked to do and to challenge, and in a way the result of the year is more to formulate a perfect question rather than to try to provide a result.
I am Stefano Rabolli. I got in a Deep 3 in 2004, and I'm still trying to get out of it.
Thank you very much, everybody. So, what is really at stake this afternoon, I think, is the future of cinematic architecture. I think it's inevitable that there will be a certain kind of retrospective touch at times to the discussion. If you lapse into endless anecdotes, I will stop you. Anyone in the audience, please feel free to raise your hand if you have questions, comments, etc., etc. This conversation is not exclusive to the players around this table. I have prepared a number of questions which I might or might not deal out to you during the course of the conversation, as if things grind to a halt, and then I have a number of hand signals with Julian and Rubens, so when it gets boring, we might not continue the full 3 or 4 or 5 hours, or however much it is scheduled for this afternoon. The main question has already been given by our hosts this afternoon. This is, what is cinematic architecture? I think it's maybe a little bit much to open that question up straight away, at least as an open question. But it seems nonetheless a very natural place to start. And what I would like to do is to ask some of the oldest students, not the the people who were in the unit a long time ago, and who've had a kind of benefit of experience, what it is of cinematic architecture that they have been able to, or what it is that of the work of Deep 3 that they have been able to make use of, for example, in commercial practice. I would actually like to start by putting the question to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Ingerid. Yes, I think, yes, we're going back to, in the question, the value of teaching, because I think the idea of any teaching project is really to enable you, to equip you with the right questions to formulate when you're faced with a brief. I think that in a way we studied in the year in '97 the site was Hiroshima, and I think we went back in time obviously to find a catastrophic event, and that catastrophic event in a way generated the brief. How do you respond in an architectural way? How do you intervene in a context which is already removed from you in time, but also in a place which no longer exists? The field of intervention was Hiroshima. I think there have been, since '97, there have obviously been there have been major events that have happened in the world, like 9/11, and somehow I feel as though the questions that we asked at that time made these events like 9/11 much more real to us. In a way, they now allowed us to put that sort of event into perspective. When we see what is now emerging in New York, it seems a little bit like a wasted opportunity. One wonders whether cinematic architecture and the things that it put forward, the approach that it put forward, couldn't have been suggested as a response to an event like that. That just might be a question of time. I think if there was something more material and more concrete, maybe that would be something that we could have responded to at the time.
But so you mean a way of engaging with processes then?
Yes, I think so. I think it's almost, for me, it's more a question of putting an emphasis on the absence that you create, rather than responding with a material presence. I think one of the unit's strong points is to propose something which is constructed of materials like light, materials which evoke a sense of absence and presence and an ephemeral quality, which is a long way from a simple material response.
But the question of process and the question of engaging with a given situation, what's the difference between that and just simply architecture with a social conscience? Is there a spatial aspect to it? When you talk about 9/11, for example, and an architecture that responds to
No, I think that in a way the response was there was a demand for some kind of memorial to be materialized around this event, and I sometimes wonder whether there couldn't have been something which was introduced into this to follow this event, which enabled us to collectively discover our own memories rather than having something represented for us.
As far as I understand from what I've read in the book, the shift in sites that the unit has done over the last years, I'm not so familiar with the most recent work since it's after I moved away, but when I was teaching, we chose quite loaded sites, like Hiroshima, for example. It was 50 years since the dropping of the bomb, and Sarajevo, the recent war, things like that. Places that were already kind of invested with something that was meant to provoke the students to make certain reflections. And I understand that in recent years the unit has moved away from that to more, in a way, idyllic situations that leave the students freer to define their own problems, as Julian said. Would you say that is, what kind of effect does that have? Stefano?
Yes, well, in my year, the site was Gibraltar, which apparently is an offensive site, but it was actually quite a dramatic experience.
Why
First
offensive?
Of all, no, unoffensive.
Oh, unoffensive.
Yeah,
Right.
it's like this idyllic location that you're describing. But paradoxically, there was like this village, this city known because John Lennon got married there, and because they were the only...
Married?
Married, yeah.
Oh,
John Lennon got
right.
married in Gibraltar.
I didn't know.
And it is the only place where there are wild monkeys in the rock. And I think probably this is one of the reasons why Pascal decided to go there.
Are those two things related?
Yeah, but the two things are not related. But it's not related with the notion of catastrophe that you mentioned before. Because actually when you go there, there is this paradoxical place that is just inhabited mainly by Spanish people and some very big Moroccan communities, and everyone feels more British than in England because they're so proud about this political position that they have in this situation. And it's like a city which is suspended between a very ambitious past and a very concerned future. And in this situation, we had to find something that was problematic enough, or something that could have raised our attention. And the site that we were given was this huge water catchment, this big surface on the east side of the mountain, where we should have placed our project. But I think that what is interesting about this observation that you mentioned before is the fact that they are not idyllic place. Even in this apparent peaceful situation, there were crucial issues happening there, starting from the fact that it was apparently a dead city, the fact that there were no future possible developments, and the huge problem of the Moroccan people that were coming constantly from the other side of the sea. And I think that even in this case, the unit wanted to challenge this idea of crisis, which is contained probably by the title itself, because the catastrophe at the end is the catastrophe of space, because cinema and architecture are almost like two poles of an oppositions. And every time Pascal was very sensible to this type of paradox, to the point that one of the things that I remember the most was when he said that when you needed to find a title for your work, you always have to include a contradiction. And ultimately, this is the contradiction of cinematic architecture, something that probably by definition cannot be built or cannot be physical.
Eyal, you said that you're still struggling to get out of Dip 3.
I think
that was me.
So what was it you said?
Something similar.
Meaning that you're happy with still being in the unit, or still struggling to liberate yourself?
When Brett now presented the unit, I was kind of surprised because he said there's a third book, therefore that would make it a trilogy. And I remember something that Pascal was saying in '96. He said, I think, or you, or in the unit when we were sitting there, because you were also teaching at the time that I was a student. And Pascal said, if you're thinking about a trilogy, no, I mean, you cannot go outside of the frame of Dante. No? I mean, the trilogy is always Paradiso, Inferno, and Purgatorio. No? And then, in fact, he said, the problem is that nobody is interested in the other two. Everybody just wants to read about Inferno. No? And there is a certain kind of this issue of horror, right? That kind of I think even in what Stefano describes and in the kind of attempts to sort of leave it and kind of go and engage with a sort of more mundane fabric of life, there is something in the kind of in the desire of cinema, you know? Both documentary and horror films, etc. And that is kind of like to document, to film that pain, no, and horror, etc. So. In a sense that, and maybe that connects as well to what Stephen was saying about, I don't know, 9/11 or all those things, and the moment where the kind of the necessity, right, to expand the imagination is that moment where there is that absence, right, of that becomes the loss of the building, or when there's a stake in memory, right? There's political stakes in memory. Either in kind of, let's say, fixing the historical record somehow, or in a way of giving it any form, right? And in that sense, I think in 1996 Pascal ruined my life, no, because I got stuck with that kind of an Inferno, no, and that is sort of, I wouldn't say kind of what attracts one to the extreme. Let's say the darker side of urbanism, of architecture, of reality. I mean, you know that my work was dealing with war, with the intersection between architecture, war, memory, etc. No, especially in Palestine, but as well in other places. But I think that this is where there's a kind of a stake in these techniques, no, and any form of optimism, etc., is coming from the kind of collapse of one time into another, which is what the imagination of filmic architecture could do, no? That there is something beyond the kind of the material present which is in front of you. There's something buried in it. There's something kind of that needs to be, unearthed, teased out of that reality. So I guess this is what I meant when I.
So paradise can no longer satisfy you? Is that
paranoia?
No, paradise.
Paranoia
would be perfect.
Maybe it's kind of in a sort of dolorist way. It kind of comes out of pain. I don't know.
In what way is this still haunting you then?
Well, let's say that
in what you're doing today.
Yeah, no. Let's say that. Okay. I mean, in my recent book, no. I mean, there's a way in which a kind of a description of the intersection of built environment and violence is always mediated through images, right? And in a sense, one starts describing even the operational aspect of built environment through the way in which it not only kind of represented in media, but itself is media, no? In a sense that I am very basic kind of way of, can we understand, like the most, let's say, violent borders of our time as actual, not only as barriers, but as sensors, no? As apparatuses, as kind of filmic apparatuses, no? I mean, in a sense, they are sensors because when you touch them, they register, no? I mean, they create a kind of a visual field around them that somehow, in a sense, I feel is more effective even than the kind of the physical barrier in it. No, I mean the wall and borders exist as a media space. No, and in a sense, this is something that very much informed my work. Also, in a way in which another thing that I was writing about. The way in which, let's say, violence or urban warfare start redefining relationship of the urban. No, the minute that kind of extreme violence happens within the city, again, it is kind of mediated through film and through images. No, I mean, I remember a kind of an image that maybe literally does what Pascal was kind of talking about for a long time, and that is that, in a sense, that last barrier of privacy, no, of architecture, the constant of a wall, a private, a domestic wall, no, kind of evaporate the minute that you have media that allow you to see through walls, no. The seeing through walls is the kind of really the image of that frontier of the intersection of violence and architecture. And this is, when the American military are now exercising several types of warfare in Iraq, they have certain radars, no, that may allow you to see through the wall. And they have certain ammunition that allow you to shoot through the wall. And in a sense, architecture in that way completely evaporates. I mean, everything that is solid melts into the background of the screen, no, to paraphrase another point. No, so in that sense, architecture simply becomes an organizing apparatus for bodies in space, no? And we were all talking about transparent concrete, I think in the past sort of 10 years, no? How to make architecture completely both structural and translucent. And I think that is the way, no? I mean, the effect of that extreme form of violence on the materiality of architecture through these technologies is exactly what evaporates it, no? As a material reality. So I think that on those kind of extreme edges of the intersection of violence and architecture, you start feeling and you start seeing that kind of effect of media that Pascal was knew, right? Where we're talking to us about.
I would like to take that evaporating wall, whether it's shot to pieces or whether it is kind of dissolved through technology or media, and go to Ron Kenley, whose essay in this book is about the cinematic house.
Yes, the exhibition.
Yes, the exhibition that was here at the EA a few years ago, which was in a way, as far as I know it, a realization of a long time kind of dream house that was always present somehow in the discussions of the unit. And somehow ask you about the ability of this melting architecture to organize life. That installation was extremely simple. What was it really? Was it a house?
It wasn't that simple. I didn't think it was that simple. Anyway, I did not write about the house itself. I wrote about the film I made of the house, which is, it's different, no, but it's important because it sets up the relationship between what we use to make something, all of us, even as architects, and what are the consequences of that? In other words, what kind of intelligence constructs whatever it is? I think a famous architect who described himself as a literary man, Le Corbusier, had said at the end of his life that the only thing which is transmissible is la pensée, the thought.
Which is
The thought?
Yeah.
That can be transmitted.
Oh, yeah,
It can be transmitted, sorry. I have a microphone, it's okay. The problem is that 11 microphones, which ones is he going to use and how many tracks? So if the only thing that gets transmitted is the architectural thought, forgive the translation, what is an architectural thought? In other words, what is the materiality of an architectural thought? And perhaps the materiality of an architectural thought is in the power of invention. In other words, in the power of engaging with an architectural intelligence that's already in every place, a way of organizing the space that we enter, that already understands lots of things about the space, like putting a screen over there so that the light is not coming through in a certain way, and the way the projections are happening and the rearrangements, all that is to do with this. And then all of a sudden there's another space that is a project of the Purgatorium, I think you said it was what's happening around this table. New construction that is going to have a consequence by engaging with the existing space. And for me, the exhibition, at least the way I saw it when I spent time in it, was about that, about how this other construction had the value of foyer, of a hearth, of a center, of something that was attracting and making people meet. I think the last time we met was on the step of the entrance of the cinematic house, by the way. It's all recorded in the film, so it's true. And I think that's it. I think that it's a moment when an architectural thought becomes visible and transmissible, and that is what happened there.
Was it a house?
Was it a house?
Yes, was it a house? Or was it an installation?
It was called a house.
I know it was called a house. Was it a house?
Since it was called a house, we can look in what way it was a house. When I was thinking about it, trying to write about it, I saw it more as a room within a larger system of rooms, and that maybe your question is to what extent a room as a space is a house, or a house is an assemblage of rooms, and whether it is a distribution of the spaces that makes the house, or whether it is the sequence in which one space anticipates the other. In other words, the exhibition hall had a certain access to it, which we know it's the same, from the square to the exhibition room. That access was then responded to in the construction, in creating another room, but which was organizing its own other spaces. So in that sense, it was part of a sequence of spaces, a house within a house, a room within a room, or a series of rooms. But for me, the important thing was that it was like a series of spaces that were anticipating one another and continuing. In that sense, yes, it is a house. There could have been something else, another architectural thought.
Well, one definition of architecture anyway is the distribution of material in such a way that it organizes life. And there lies somehow my question of whether or not this was a house, because the ambition was always to reduce the materiality to a minimum and somehow replace it with something else. For example, a sequence of images, something like a film, which then organizes life, but in a different way, presumably. So it's
the life of images. It was a house. It was a house for images to live in, and images and movie images, particularly, don't live the same way as human beings. So it was a house in which you would find the vitality of images.
But where you yourself had no part to play then? There was something to look at rather than...
It's a house of images. It's the images that live there. We're just visitors.
Yes, however, if I may. However, the images that you are seeing were often the shadows and the people that you were meeting in there. So there was all the time, I thought it was the meeting that was the main thing between that which were the projected images, that which was a reflection on the glass, the light that was coming in anyways through the shutters of the windows to the square, the sounds of people moving through, the mobile phone that was ringing inside, and the crossing of the two spotlights of the beams of the projecting parts of the films, such as Keiichi's and so on. So there were always new situations that were set out that were clearly influencing each other.
But were they influencing each other? I mean, there should be, sorry, for those of you who haven't seen this installation, it's described in the book. It was here a few years ago. And I mean, of course, when people are moving around an installation of projected light, they will cast shadow onto the thing. But isn't that purely incidental? Is it? Can you call it engagement?
In the sense that most engagements are results of coincidences.
Yeah. But they have no consequence for each other then.
I mean, the point of projection is only one pole of cinematic architecture, obviously. The other pole is the point at which the camera looked at that scene and recorded it. And it always seemed to me when I was in the crits and looking at the students' films that cinematic architecture was a kind of tangent that was always coming up, or perhaps about to come up, or might come up next as the students' cameras moved through the world. And it manifested itself, sometimes it didn't, but it manifested itself in that process of exploration. And it was as if shooting the film for some of the students, I think, had the effect of slowing down the concentration upon places, and in some sense, bringing out the vision of what architecture there was to be found in that place.
But again, I think that somehow the question remains as to what happens then when these films, or the projections in the house for that matter, when people read them. I mean, at one point, at what point does it go out of being or stop being a picture of something and become a real sorry, a proposition, or a point at which other people can really enter and engage with it?
Suggestion on that is actually that the title of the book sets up a predicament, really. I mean, we're discussing the installation, which is one thing, but I think the work done on cinematic architecture somehow, I think, is best represented by some of the projects which are here. So I like what Brian is saying. You know, I think, obviously, I've got a warped view since I've seen the 17 years of progress. I've seen many of the projects and also seen them in progress. But I
You're
think,
registered in the book as having failed the unit, so you have a very special
that's true. But the issue is that I think that it's the combination of all those things. So I like the fact that Brian has said the exploration, the films, the possible suggestion of objects, the history through it, the personal views, and so on. So it's not images. You know, and I actually think, you know, we do react with images anyway, whether we buy the product or we don't. I mean, we live in a world of images anyway, but I don't think it's at that level. I think it's a mixture of all those things. And I think one of the problems with Pascal's, let's say, legacy in terms of the title of this book is that for me it's very difficult to disengage cinematic architecture from Diploma 3 or Pascal, because I see the whole experience that people went through. I see that it's not the Hiroshima that I read in the news. I have another Hiroshima, which was Stephen Ware's when he presented and read his text. So you reinterpreted something which I knew in a different way, and you presented it in a different way. Now, I quite like that. I still have the memory of Stephen reading an extract from the book, which is all you were allowed to do at the time, and transporting me into this world, you know, which was absolutely fantastic. So I think there is a sort of a problem with actually applying cinematic architecture, partly because its roots with cinema, in which you are controlled to a certain degree and you're a viewer and it's a kind of a product to a certain degree, and secondly because I think it encompassed an understanding of things at, you know, what I'll call, for lack of a better word, a poetic level, which I think people managed to work with, which I think is very unconsumable. I think people don't pick it up. I think it's very hard to sell it. You know, it's not something you can just go to Sainsbury's and buy one. It's very hard for the magazines to even do anything with it, because it wouldn't, you know, it requires a lot of effort to work with. So I think that's the where I think, you know, I find it very difficult whenever I look at any outside project from the unit and so on, and the work that I've seen that's there. What I think is really exciting about it is the idea that it suggests an understanding of space which is a lot more complex than all the conversations that are being had, which is a relationship between memory and images and physical objects and experience and learning and so on.
I completely agree. But I just qualify what I meant by image there. I did not mean a sort of graphic icon that can be an image in this case is slightly more like what you're referring to in Corbusier. It's a phenomenon that the mind holds, and it actually involves time. The image that would be unfolded in some of those films would be something that took time to come off the film, and be in some sense shared and registered in the crit actually. It's a mental image, and it's that template which I think sometimes some of the students were able to find ways of translating into a more conventionally tectonic proposition.
Martino?
Just on that last one, I think that's a very important thing that actually came up to me when I went through the book for the first time. That I had the impression that there's a certain uncertainty or even confusion between the concept of the image as a material object and the imaginary, or actually the picture, and a confusion also between the idea of the ephemeral or the light and the material. I think I don't think I agree with the idea that you can arrive at an immaterial image by trying to take matter away. I think also everything material also has an immaterial side. You can arrive at that without going through light. I mean, architecture light, immaterial is not for me a logical. I mean, I think there's a certain confusion between image and imaginary, and between ephemeral and immaterial. I would like to go back to your very first question. I mean, I've kind of tried to follow a bit what people have been saying, and your very first question was, what is cinematic architecture? And immediately we were talking about Hiroshima, 9/11, the refugee situation in Gibraltar, Palestine, and this, all seems to be, to me, a very, kind of coming to terms with traumatic experiences, and also what I found very interesting that several of you pointed out afterwards, that you were still kind of struggling to get out of this cinematic experience. So, I mean, apparently there's another traumatic issue there, so I wonder if, rather than talking about architecture, you were really actually talking about some kind of collective psychoanalysis, and how does that relate to, I guess what I still think, maybe this is a very Swiss point of view, what is the task of architecture to in the end, I think, is to build, maybe not build materially, but build images at least somehow. So I wonder, I mean, for me the question is very important now. I mean, I have the impression that we're really, the issue at stake is the performance of psychoanalysis. And I wonder how would people that are, closer involved here relate that to the question of architecture?
Can I pick up on something? I think that in a way, for architecture to happen, architecture in the conventional terms, talking about a building. For a building to happen, there has to be something that disappears too. You could talk about there's a virgin site and it's beautiful because it's empty and because you have a view to something else, and things will disappear. We tend to concentrate on what will appear, and the views that may block, and the views that may you may be creating too once you're inside the building. But there are an awful lot of things that disappear when you create something. And I think that in a way, if we're talking about how can cinematic architecture be applied, I think that it does, having been through the process in a way of asking these questions, I think it does equip you with a certain sense, an intuitive sense of what will disappear when you intervene as an architect, and how to address those and to integrate them into some kind of brief. So it's not just simply about, I have my spreadsheet here and I have my perspective, which I've done for so and so there, and I'm going to try and get the thing put together. And I think that you have to address these absences which will occur by the presence of your building. And yes, in a way, it's a very kind of psychological process to go through. And but I think unless we address those absences, this is why I referred to 9/11. I think unless you address that absence and you try to do something with that absence, I think in a way, once the building appears, you've lost it. It's not there anymore, and you can no longer call on it as an empirical point within your brief.
See, for me, the image doesn't come from an absence. For me, it's something very constructive. So I really don't agree at all.
I think just on your comment. I mean, I think it's since you're the one who says that you're the odd man out and you know the least and so on. I mean, I think on a light level, a series of tutorials by Pascal was very similar to psychoanalysis. They were very long and group sessions and all the rest of it. So I think a lot of actually breaking up of the physicality is actually to do with a deeper perception of what physicality is. And I think that's absolutely integral in the unit. It's not a process. I mean, I think the way Stephen describes it is fine, but I mean, it sounds as if, there's a system to actually make the physical non-physical. No, I think it's a highly cultural and charged process. And that's why I think, I think that's what Brian was sort of hinting at in terms of the involvement that's there. And the other thing which I think is very critical to the work that I admire of what's been produced is the personal level in it. I mean, I don't think, someone just attempting to create a formalization which includes, the ephemeral with the physical and so on. I've always found that it's one of its greatest strengths has been the personal involvement within that and the role taken by the author. And I think that's something that Pascal has truly demonstrated through his work. And I think in the first book, I found one of the absolutely most amazing things in terms of creating a space was, I'd heard the stories before too, was Pascal describing his childhood in Berlin as part of this book of what he's writing about. And I think that's what makes those chapters in the book so incredibly strong, because you are seeing that, someone's talking about walking on ruins. Who actually walked on ruins is just telling you a story, but it's integrated, it's weaved into the text that you're reading. So I think, it's not psychoanalysis, but I think there is a high level of actually understanding that images are much more sophisticated than an image, and the depth in them and the kind of sort of emotional depth and psychological depth is very important.
And I think you're right to a certain extent as well when you call it group therapy, because the question that we always asked was why? Why do something? Why bother? Why architecture? Why build something? Why intervene? Why make a proposal? And of course, if answering the question why in a situation that either is loaded or becomes loaded is a very personal thing, is a very engaged thing. And when you ask in a group like this, why, and you have to discuss it and you have to articulate it in the presence of other people, not just in the corner of your studio, yes, it does become a very involved session in that sense. But in a way, I think, and if I've come away with from the unit with anything, is that it's almost impossible for me now to do anything without asking why. And you would have thought that it was an obvious question, but it's maybe, and especially in a school of architecture, the question that's least asked, because the program is so often given. Either the program for a building, if that's the kind of investigation that's going on, or the program in terms of media, in terms of whatever it is that you're engaging with. And so to ask why, I mean, we had some students who unfortunately came out unable to do anything because they couldn't see that their engagement with the situation was necessary. And if it had been a positive statement, I think it would have been a very bold proposition, actually. But somehow the circumstances of the school, even here, made that impossible to say, my diploma is, I'm not going to do anything. So there was a certain amount of anxiety come review time with the students who haven't really been able to find any point of engagement. But yes, and I think Carlos points it as well when he talks about the personal aspect of the work. You need to find your reason for doing architecture.
And I think that this even links with this notion of house, because I think that some questions are deliberately tricky. First of all, I think that by definition, as I said, cinematic architecture is something that cannot be applied. And the house itself, you really tackled before this, what is a house? Is it